how have you seen climate change impact winter sports, uh, really across the board, and in the context of during the winter games, and like this year's winter games as well?
So our planet is warming on average, and right now we're looking at about a 1.3 degrees Celsius global average rise in temperatures compared to pre-industrial levels, so like 1800s temperatures. That, from a winter sport perspective, means that we are shortening the seasons that ski resorts, for example, could be open. That might cut into their profitability, but it also cuts into the opportunities that people have to even participate in those sports. If you decrease the amount of time that they have available, if it's too warm for snow to stick for a long enough period of time, you're obviously not going to be able to participate in those sports. So I think that climate change is a big concern for these sports that are so dependent upon precise, not just meteorological, but climatological conditions for their sports to actually exist and thrive.
And one of the things I've seen come up about, I think you kind of touched on it there, access with regard to these winter sports is that's being impacted too by the limitation of sites, correct?
Absolutely. And as somebody in the sport industry, I want for everybody to be able to participate in sport, but some of these are so dependent upon, again, the environmental conditions, but also the geographical conditions. Where I live in Florida, you're not going to go snow skiing. And so people have to travel to the appropriate locations, be it in Colorado, for example, to participate in downhill skiing. It has huge implications for access to the sport, because if you decrease the number of locations that are viable for skiing, it's going to make it all the more difficult for people to travel to locations where they might actually be able to participate in these sports. On the other end of the spectrum, with, let's say, not winter sports, increasing levels of heat threaten our ability to actually just enjoy the everyday sports that we enjoy outside anyway. If we're constantly surpassing safe heat thresholds, we might be dealing with pauses in competition, water breaks, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, all these things on a regular basis rather than just perhaps in July and August.
One of the things with this year's games specifically was the need for snow cannons and artificial snow for a lot of these downhill events. How unprecedented is it for all of the snow to be artificial, and what kind of impacts environmentally and on athletes does artificial snow actually leave behind?
So every Olympic Winter Games since the 90s, since basically 1992, has used artificial snow. But this will be the first event that is 100% dependent upon artificial snow. They were not going to have natural snowfall, nor cold enough temperatures in that region sufficient to just host these events on what they already, the territory that they already have. From an environmental standpoint, most artificial snow is created using massive amounts of water, but also chemicals that help the snow stick on the ground a little bit longer. We've been under the impression that the snow in Beijing is not using those chemicals, so it is just 100% water. But if it sticks on the ground longer, that can impact the vegetation underneath that might be trying to grow through in the spring. Certainly the chemicals are things that could seep into the soil and into your watershed from there. And from an athletic standpoint, most of the athletes have been complaining about the quality of the snow, because artificial snow is so much harder than natural snow. It hurts to fall on compared to fresh natural powder, and it just rides differently. So it's still skiing, it's still snowboarding, they're still the same sport, but it's as if the playing field is a little bit different at this point.
What do you think this demonstrates as we head toward the future? Do you think this is going to become more of the norm? Is this going to be something that we expect to see in winter games going forward? And do you think athletes need to start preparing in different ways for this environment?
I think that this is a sign of things to come, and not that we are never going to have natural snow ever again, but that the pool of potential host cities for a Winter Olympics is going to shrink. There's been some research out there to suggest that out of all the cities that have previously hosted the Winter Olympics, if the current trends on climate change continue, only one of those 18 previous cities will actually be a viable host in the future, meaning that all the other cities will be too warm, or the snow conditions won't be good enough to actually host these events. If I'm the International Olympic Committee, I would be quite concerned about this moving forward in terms of where we can host our event. And if I'm the federations or the sports themselves, I'm concerned because that means that it might not be possible to participate in my sport in the future, or that the premier global event that showcases my sport is not in the conditions that we want to showcase. Athletes, will have to travel greater distances or plan, trips around the world in order to train rather than sticking with maybe 1 or 2 locations per year. So it's going to have some impacts on these sports in the future. I think beyond a doubt, you're going to see these warming trends decrease the amount of time that skiing and snowboarding and these other alpine sports are viable, and restrict access to them.
Do you have any final thoughts to add just about the impact climate change is having on winter sports and winter environments, and these games in particular you want to share with us?
Sure. I don't look at these games as being anybody's fault, so much as I view them as being a warning signal for the future of these Olympic events. A lot of communities these days are not interested in hosting anymore, and we've seen so many communities be put up for candidacy, and then just the residents reject the idea of hosting the Olympics altogether. So if you combine that 1-2 punch of fewer cities that want to host these games with worse climatological conditions where it's too warm to host these games, the list of cities who could potentially host the Olympics is going to shrink dramatically. And I think personally that the IOC needs to make some changes in terms of what the expectations are for the Winter Games, what sports are there, how big the event is, so that we can continue to hold them moving forward, and so that we can continue to enjoy them the way that we are today. But if trends continue the way that they have been, they're going to be in some danger with respect to winter sports.
Hey, well, Dr. Ross, I again appreciate your time here this afternoon, and thanks for talking to me on this pretty important subject. I mean, climate change, not just Winter Games, but impacts all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.